Hello all. Our last lecture this week is about lynchings. The period of the late 19th century after the Reconstruction to the early 20th century is often called the nadir of race relations. And nadir just means low point. And this period saw a severe rise in lynchings and activities of groups like the KKK. And one thing you're going to notice about my lecture for this topic is there's not a lot of photographs. That's not because there's not photographic evidence. One of the things that you guys have access to this week is a project called Without Sanctuary, and it's a collection of postcards and other photographic evidence. I've chosen not to add that into my lecture because I know that that's a sensitive subject for some people and that the images can be extremely graphic, and I didn't want to take anyone off guard or overwhelm anyone and make it impossible for them to watch the lecture. So you guys will be doing a separate reading as a part of our required reading this week on lynchings, and it's really more photographic reading, so it's really more looking at pictures, and they actually on the website have a flash style movie that you can look at where they just move from picture to picture, because sometimes it can be hard to get past any of those images. So I understand that if it's too hard for you to look at it, there is written material on the website, and I hope you'll read that and make sure that you understand this very important topic to our class. So lynchings, some of the statistics of the period about lynchings from 1890 to 1899, there averaged 188 lynchings per year. 82% of those occurred in the South, and 32% of the victims were white. So there is a myth and a misnomer that they are only African Americans that are lynched. The majority of people who are lynched are African American, and often if a white person is lynched, it's because they were seen kind of helping or aiding an African American person. So from 1900 to 1909, there averaged about 93 a year. 92% of them occurred in the South, and 11% of the victims were white. So we can make a few conclusions as we look at these two periods. As I said in my introductory slide, this period is often called the nadir of race relations. And what that means is this is the low point between white people and African American people. And we see a lot of racially motivated violence. And another thing we're not even going to get a chance to talk about really is race riots. I chose to focus on lynching because I feel like that is probably one of the bigger violations of civil rights. So, and you can also see that while the number does go down some with our second set, it becomes even more so in the South, and even more so a crime that happens to African Americans. The common myth that surrounds lynching is that it was because of African American men raping white women. So one of the topics that I kind of brought up when I was discussing Birth of a Nation is this idea that there's a very nasty stereotype about African American men and sexuality. Ida B. Wells, who I'll be addressing later in my lecture, really addresses this myth that this is what happens. And the reality is that very rarely was it because of sexually motivated crime of any kind. And as I said with the KKK, another kind of a myth about lynching is this idea that like the KKK, it was not universally accepted. We're talking about a fringe element. We're talking about extremists in the South, but we're not. These are some quotes from South Carolina Governor Benjamin Tillman about his support for intimidation of African American men, and some of the activities. So 1882, he said the black man, in his words, must remain subordinate or be exterminated. He also said the leading white men of Edgefield had decided to seize the first opportunity that Negroes might offer them to provoke a riot and teach the Negroes a lesson by having the whites demonstrate their superiority by killing as many as was justifiable. And then he was addressing Senator John C. Spooner of Wisconsin, who had said that they were trying to remove African American rights. And he said, he asked me, was it right to murder them in order to carry the elections? I never saw one murdered. I never saw one shot at an election. It was the riots before the elections, precipitated by their own hot-headedness in attempting to hold government, that brought on conflicts between the races and caused the shotgun to be used. And that is what I mean by saying we use the shotgun. So one of the things that this racially motivated violence and this mob violence and lynchings are used is to intimidate African American voters. They will basically intimidate them, and before the election, and he can say that, but even at the elections there was often intimidation against African Americans who might turn out to vote. So much so that by the early 20th century, and by the time we get to the Civil Rights Movement, most African Americans had accepted that they didn't effectively have the right to vote in this country. One thing that we're not talking about as much is that they use other methods like poll taxes to stop African Americans from voting. So there was also a lot of activism to end lynching. The NAACP and Ida B. Wells both worked towards ending lynching. I'm going to focus this part of the lecture on Wells, just because she was one of the most well-known activists against lynching, and she really broke out of what was normally designed as a woman's area to speak out consistently against this. So Wells herself was born during the Civil War in 1862 to slave parents, but clearly as young as she was, she didn't really experience slavery herself. She was a journalist, and before she became a part of kind of this call for justice against lynching, she had already spoken up against ideas like segregation and other civil rights of African Americans. And she says herself that up until she lost 3 friends in 1892, she kind of bought into the myth of lynching, that it was something that happened rarely, and that it only happened in extreme cases, and usually only when it was a black a man raping a white woman. And she says that she herself bought into that kind of propaganda that's perpetrated about lynchings, that it still even goes on today that many people believe that. And in 1892, she had 3 friends who were lynched. Tom Moss was her friend, Calvin McDowell and Henry Sir were 2 friends of theirs, and that were lynched with him. And they were lynched not because of an assault on a white woman, but because there was, they owned an independent African American business, and one of their white competitors hired off-duty sheriffs, police officers, to come and trash their house, and they had guns and defended themselves, and basically in the end they were lynched because of that. And I think for Wells that was really eye-opening. She, like I said, she herself says in several of her writings that up until then she really believed the story that was told. but that changes dramatically once it happens to friends of hers. As I said, in her books, she starts to collect data. She's a journalist. So she starts to collect data about why these lynchings are happening, how often they're happening, where they're happening. And she finds out, much like the statistics I quoted to you earlier, that they're not a small part of the population. And they're not just isolated to a few areas. And it's really far more widespread than she had originally realized. So this is a quote from her: "Nobody in this section of the community believes that old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. If Southerners are not careful, a conclusion might be reached that will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women." And what she's speaking about is one of the things she found when she started to research these cases is that sometimes when an African American man was lynched, we're talking about him having consensual sexual relations with a white woman, or marrying a white woman, or a situation like that. And that's what she was talking about, is that even when it was a case of sex, it was not usually rape, but a strong speaking out against any kind of interracial relationships, even if they were consensual. So she wrote some pamphlets and a book on it. Her pamphlet, which is one of your readings this week, is called Southern Horrors, the Lynch Law in All Its Phases. And that was written and published by support from people where she was in New York, because after she wrote the piece about lynching, she was actually driven out of Memphis for fear of her own life. And then she also wrote a book called The Red Record, which discussed lynching and the problem with lynching. She advocated pretty much her entire life for a federal anti-lynching law, which is still something that is mostly absent. And she worked with and founded several organizations for civil rights: the National Association of Colored Women, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, and the NAS. She worked with the National Equal Rights League to advocate for the woman's right to vote. So she does focus on lynching, but I think that's because at the time she really felt like that was the greatest danger to African Americans. In addition, one of the things that I think was probably one of her more brilliant moves is that she toured England and gave speeches on the lynching problem in America. And this is important because unfortunately during this period, African American voices were not being heard. She was speaking loudly, and people were often dismissing her because she was black. And when she kind of took it to another country, her goal was to see them put pressure. America didn't want to be seen as not a civilized nation among other world powers. So that's why she did 2 tours of England where she gave lectures and talked about what she discovered about lynching and what lynching was really like in this country, as opposed to the myths that were being perpetrated about it. Okay, so in conclusion, like I said, there are a few myths that are often perpetrated about lynchings. One is that there were only a few of them. It happened rarely and not very often. And as you saw from our earlier statistics, that's not the case at all. It was actually rather widespread. And while it happens predominantly in the South, it happened in the South and the North. It becomes a form of entertainment, which is something you're going to look at more with the Without Sanctuary. As I mentioned earlier in this lecture, I chose to not include those photographs in my lecture because I feel like they can be overwhelming for some students, and I just didn't want you to not be able to watch this lecture because you couldn't handle the photographic evidence that I was presenting. But I do think that the website and the collection that James Allen has put together is extremely important. And even if you could only read his discussion about how he found them, it's really important to understand how widespread this was, how it was a form of entertainment, that people were taking picnic lunches and their children, and they would pull down pieces from the body. It's really horrifying, the macabre fascination people had with this, and how it's not an extreme faction. It is mainstream society that participated in this like they were going to the movies. Some of the other myths that surround it, as I said, is that it was a punishment for black men who raped white women. And that's just simply not the case. Most were for a reprisal for economic advancement or political advancement or any kind of social advancement of an African American. And that even, as Ida B. Wells points out, that sometimes there were consensual relationships where the African American man could be punished by lynching. And then it's important to understand that African Americans fought against this, that much like protesting and boycotting the birth of a nation, we so often focus on the civil rights movement that we forget that there are civil rights activism pretty much from the founding of our country in various ways, and that African Americans really are very involved and invested, and that in particular African American women were calling out lynching and saying this is not okay. That Ida B. Wells often would make appeals to club movements for donations to go to her speaking tours in England and her pamphlets, and that club women really supported, and I know that's a part of the broader history that I'm not going to get to talk about as much, but during this period, African American women were a part of social clubs, and they often did political activism in order to what they called uplift their race. So they were also very involved in the anti-lynching campaign. So this is my reference slide this week. There's a couple articles about Benjamin Tillman if you want to go and look at him. And then there's also your weekly reading, which is, the pamphlet, The Southern Horrors Lynch Law in All Its Phases. And that's all for this week. Thanks, guys. You have a great day.